Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this high-level discussion on forced displacement and demographic engineering in Syria. So I think we decided to start a few more participants will join, so we'll try our best to accommodate with the space. And then we'll probably close in 5 minutes if you still have, anyone who wants to join. I think 5 minutes, and then we will close the door. My name is Natasha Braque. I am a French lawyer, and I work with the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute, IBAHRI for short. This event has been organized in partnership with the Geneva Academy within the framework of the Geneva Peace Week. The IBAHRI is an organization representing the voice of the legal profession and promotes and protects the human rights and the independence of the legal profession. As part of our mandate, we have worked on Syria, and we have worked more particularly on a 2-year project with the International Legal Assistance Consortium, ILAC, who is represented today by Rodri Williams, one of our panelists. And this 2-year project, works with a delegation of 14 Syrian lawyers, and we're working with them on building the capacity in order to engage with UN human rights mechanisms and also address accountability issues. And this is within this framework that last September we came to Geneva with the delegation, and we met with various UN representatives, state missions, and experts such as Barbara McAlin, who I will introduce shortly. And the topic of demographic engineering, forced displacement, housing, land and property rights issue was at the center of most of the meetings and discussions we were having. And this is why we decided to organize an event within the framework of the Geneva Peace Week. And this is why you're here all today to discuss those issues. The word demographic engineering has been widely used in the context of Syria. But do we really know what this means? And this is what I've been trying to actually find out. I've been trying to look for a definition of demographic engineering. And it was very difficult. It was a very difficult endeavor. And I finally found a definition in Paul Morland's book called Demographic Engineering, Population Strategies in Ethnic Conflict. And he defined demographic engineering as the intentional manipulation of demography by groups in conflict. So it's a very basic definition. There is no official definition of demographic engineering. Various policies, strategies, action can be used to alter the demographic balance between groups in conflict, such as we have all heard in the context of Syria, siege, starvation, persecution of certain categories of civilians, as well as the adoption of legislation and policies by the government. The question then arises, is demographic engineering illegal? And it is important to understand that demographic engineering is not a legal concept. It is not a crime per se in itself under international law. Demographic engineering has social, economic, cultural implications, but also can have legal consequences. And acts and actions used to fulfill demographic strategies can lead to serious violation of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, such as forced displacement, which we will discuss today, or persecution. But while looking at these violations through the lens of demographic engineering, if we already have crimes international law regulating those acts and actions, and crimes that would help us to prosecute those responsible. And the reason is because it is necessary to address the crimes committed during the armed conflict and the violation that would result from it during the reconstruction and rebuilding stage. It is necessary to have a comprehensive approach that touches issues of demographic engineering. Ignoring the context in which violations were and are continuing to be committed will only lead to injustice and frustration from the victims and further violation at the reconstruction stage. So the discussion today will focus on how demography has been altered and used as a strategy during the conflict in Syria by using two main examples, forced displacement and housing, land and property rights issues. And the discussion will then turn to post-conflict Syria and how demographic engineering should be taken into account for reconstruction efforts in order to avoid further violations and altering the peace-building process. I will, having discussed now the definition of demographic engineering, I will now give the floor to Marco Sassoli, who will give a more legal approach to the international legal framework. Sorry, I will first introduce you Marco Sassoli, and then also Barbara McKelling before you start your presentation. So Marco Sassoli is the director of the Geneva Academy. He is the professor of international law at the University of Geneva. He's also a commissioner with the International Commission of Jurists and a special advisor to the international human rights law to the prosecutor of the ICC. He has published in international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and international criminal law, and is recognized as a leading expert in international humanitarian law. After Marco Sassoli's presentation, Barbara McKelling will lead the discussion. Barbara has kindly agreed to moderate the event. She is a fantastic expert on housing, land and property in forced displacement context. She has 20 years of professional experience as a field practitioner, researcher and advocate working in these issues for UN organizations and NGOs, such as the Norwegian Refugee Council. She recently worked on violations of housing, land and property rights in Syria in urban context, so she is one of the best experts we could have today to moderate this panel. And she will introduce the discussion today and all the other panelists. Thank you very much for coming, and I hope you have a nice time.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Good evening. Welcome to the Geneva Academy. Thank you to the Human Rights Institute of the International Bar Association to have organized with us this event, and thank you for so many of you to have come. I'm an international law professor, so I will mainly speak about the legal framework. And fortunately, the legal framework is quite clear. There are nevertheless complex humanitarian and political issues around it. So the legal framework is first that forced displacement are prohibited. There is a specific rule applicable to armed conflicts, and in Syria we have an armed conflict in Protocol Additional 2 to the Geneva Conventions, Article 17, but Syria is not a party to Protocol 2, so we have to have recourse to customary international law, and according to the ICSE study on customary humanitarian law, parties to a non-international armed conflict may not order the displacement of the civilian population in whole or part for reasons related to the conflict unless the security of the civilians involved or imperative military reasons so demand. And forced displacement in a non-international armed conflict is a war crime, and anyway, forced displacement is also a crime against humanity. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia was obviously very much concerned with forced displacement, and it has in its jurisprudence clarified that forced displacement is not only when people are actually forced, it can even happen if people voluntarily leave, if there is a coercive environment. And now, hopefully, which is not yet fully the case, obviously in Syria, there comes the moment of return of displaced persons. And there, according to the ICSE study, again, there is a rule, that's Rule 132 of their customary law study, that displaced persons have a right to voluntary return in safety to their homes or places of habitual residence as soon as the reasons for their displacement cease to exist. And so the right to return is part of the rule when the displacement was lawful, which can be the case if it was for terror security or for imperative military reasons, while which is most often the case, the displacement was unlawful, then it is a reparation for the violation, because in international law the first form of reparation is not to pay money, but what we call restitutio in integrum, to put the persons in the same situation which would have existed if the violation did not occur. And Rule 133 of the ICSE Customary Law Studies says that the property rights of displaced persons must be respected. Now, what this means more precisely, here we have non-binding United Nations principles on housing and property restitution for refugees and displaced persons, the so-called Pinheiro principles. Under those principles, refugees and internally displaced are also protected from discriminatory housing, land and restitution laws, and these laws must be transparent and consistent. If a refugee or displaced person is unlawfully or arbitrarily denied of their property, they are entitled to submit a claim for restitution to an independent and impartial body under these principles, the Pinheiro principles. Now, in the past, one conflict which has given a lot of practice on it was obviously the conflict in the former Yugoslavia, and in this context it has been stated in treaties and other international instruments that statements and commitments regarding property rights made under duress are null and void. So even if someone under duress renounces his or her property, this has no legal consequence. And in the case of the former Yugoslavia, resolutions adopted by the UN Security Council, by the UN General Assembly, and by the then UN Commission on Human Rights foresaw precisely this, and the agreement on refugees and displaced persons annexed to the famous Dayton Accords, which made, at least formally, peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina, foresaw that all refugees and displaced persons shall have the right to have restored to them property of which they are deprived in the course of hostilities since 1991, and to be compensated for any property that cannot be restored. And following condemnation for failing to implement this provision, the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Republika Srpska adopted new laws safeguarding the property rights of displaced persons, and there was a specific agreement on refugees and displaced persons annexed to the Dayton Accords, and this agreement foresaw an independent commission for real property claims of displaced persons and refugees, which received and decided any claims on real property in Bosnia and Herzegovina. A similar commission was set up in Kosovo and also in Croatia. For instance, Croatia was criticized by the UN Security Council in 1995 for establishing a too strict time limit for people to submit to reclaim their property, because a lot of people will need some time before they dare to submit such claims. Now, these obligations, the prohibition of forced displacement and the right to get the property, again, are what the lawyers call erga omnes obligations, which means that there are obligations towards all other states. And this means that every other state, and with this I come to the third state, has the right to invoke their violation and to claim performance of the obligation of reparation, restitution, and in the interest of the beneficiaries of the obligation breached. And some of these obligations are peremptory norms of international law. The proof is that two states could not agree to forcibly to today, because in 1918-19 this was still different. Today, two states could not agree between them to forcibly displace persons. And this means that states under Article 41 of the International Law Commission's articles on state responsibility must cooperate to bring to an end through lawful means any serious breach, and this is particularly important for the reconstruction, from a legal point of view, no state shall recognize as lawful a situation created by a serious breach, nor render aid or assistance in maintaining such a situation, which means that today states may not assist in maintaining a situation which resulted from the forced displacement. Just two more sentences on the humanitarian issue, which is more complicated than the legal issue. In my experience in Bosnia and Herzegovina, one of the big problems is obviously that those who were forcibly displaced, they left their houses and other people moved in. And these were often also people forcibly displaced. And there is a difficulty to send everyone to the place where they were before, and this is why such a housing and real property commission is useful. And finally, even with my legal suggestion, which is very well based in international law, that third states may not contribute, obviously from a humanitarian point of view, this means that the people who need reconstruction today in Syria are somehow taken hostage to get the respect of the law, because they will not get the reconstruction as long as their government, and they are not responsible for their government, denies the return of the displaced persons and the refugees. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good evening to all first, and thank you to IBA and the Geneva Academy for hosting this event and organizing it. I think it's a key topic, and it's great that we have so many distinguished panelists to talk about this. Since time is restricted, I'm not going to take too much time introducing the topic, but briefly, as Natasha said, there will be two parts to the discussions. During the first part, we'll talk mainly about forced displacement and to what extent maybe forced displacement in Syria amounts to demographic engineering. And during the second part, we'll look more into what's next, the prospect of reconstruction in Syria, both physical reconstruction, but also legal reconstruction, and so on. I'll dive straight into the, first about the format. At the end of each part, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. And so we'll have some 10-15 minutes, depending on how well we stick to the time. And now I will start introducing all of our panelists, first panel and second panel. And then we will start with the discussion, the presentations. So first we have Amr Shanan to my left. Amr began as an activist after the Syrian uprising by co-founding a national campaign in Syria called the Syrian People Know Their Way, which raised political awareness through an online multimedia platform. Amr collaborated with Syrian civil society organizations on human rights issues, such as housing, land and property issues. You will often hear me say HLP, that means housing, land and property. And Amr also worked on security sector reform and rule of law. At the moment, Amr is pursuing a master's degree on transitional justice here at the Geneva Academy, and is co-writing a research on HLP issues, housing, land and property. Ibrahim Olabi, next to Amr, is a member of Guernica 37, I'll explain later when I introduce Toby what Guernica 37 is. And Ibrahim is also the director of the Syrian Legal Development Program, an organization addressing international law and human rights matters arising from the Syrian conflict. SDLP, his organization, has recently established a human rights and business unit focusing on property rights in the context of Syria's reconstruction. Ibrahim also worked as a consultant for the High Commissioner for Human Rights on forced displacement and on the right to return. Then, to my right, we have Rodri Williams, a senior legal expert at ILAC, the International Legal Assistance Consortium. Rodri is in charge of the rule of law assessment work and work related to transitional justice. He's been delivering training on conflict rule of law issues, including for Syrian lawyers. And before that, he worked for 10 years as a consultant on housing, land and property, and was very much involved in the design and implementation of the property legislation implementation plan. And when I knew him back then, I used to call him the god of property. So that's for you, Rodri. Then we have Emma Beals to my left. Emma is a researcher, analyst, and sometimes journalist, who's been focused on Syria since 2012. Emma is a consultant for the European Institute of Peace and the editor of Syria in Context. She's also a visiting fellow at the Atlantic Council, among other things. Emma has done some recent research for EIP on housing, land and property, especially as it relates to safe and dignified refugee return. Finally, Toby Cadman is the co-founder of Guernica 37, a specialist law firm in the areas of working on in the area of international criminal and human rights law. Toby has been investigating and documenting war crimes in Syria for the past 7 years. And before that, he was the head of the war crime section in Bosnia's prosecutor's office. So I think with this great panelist, we can only have a great discussion. So for the first, oh, sorry, that means I should stop talking. Voila, but I'm done. So in the first part of our discussion, Amer will tell us about the scope of displacement in Syria, its characteristics, and the extent to which it does or not amount to demographic engineering. And Ibrahim will also talk a bit about that, but focus on housing, land and property issues and explain how it has been used in Syria to create displacement. The floor is yours. Thank you. Yes, you do.
Thank you, Barbara. I'll keep it brief. I will speak about mainly forced displacement in Syria, and they will focus on the regime practices on forced displacement. I will bracket out the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF and ISIS and other actors, because I think that talking about the regime is, in a way, we don't have time to talk about all the actors, so I will focus on the regime in that sense. Already in 2011, when the uprising started in Syria, the regime started using forced displacement as a tool and strategy to oppose peaceful movement by and scaring people and fearing them of arrest and torture. So people started leaving their places and houses just to escape being tortured and arrested. I will talk also about the forced displacement as the government called it a humanitarian evacuation, where other actors also they called it civilian security. So it depends. Every actor has their name. I will talk about I will a bit talk about the demographic engineering as well on this sense. The government or the regime spoke on agreements that were done in Syria in 4 mainly what's so-called the four cities, four towns agreement. These agreements, well, the word agreements perhaps means something that's too different in Syria, because in Syria these agreements means either leave or die, technically. So these agreements led people to just move from their cities to a different one. How did the regime actually used the forced displacement? As of today, there are 6.2 million Syrians who are displaced internally, 5.6 million Syrians who are refugees in the region, and that's more than half of the population of Syria. In the last year, 1.3 Syrians were displaced. And then we think here that Syrian refugees are in Europe, but actually the largest displacement is internal displacement. There were, like, as I said, 6.2 millions. What we have here is just a tip of an iceberg. On the humanitarian evacuation and forced displacement, what actually meant was chemical weapons and bombing and shelling of hospitals and infrastructures, population transfers, and siege to starvation of women and children. Since 2015, the government has been forcing citizens to move into different locations using buses, what we call the green bus, which became very symbolic in Syria. These green buses played a very critical role in Syria in the complex population swap that have been taking place across the whole country. Now it's 7 years into the conflict, and the broader pictures of Syria and the future beginning to emerge. That the future looks like a very different ethnic, sectarian, and urban rural division of the country. And the future looks like this. I don't want to emphasize that there is the conflict is sectarianism in Syria, but what I mean by sectarianism is not, it's actually it's a marker of class, geographical location, and a religious identity. Yeah. My third point is on demographic changes in Syria. I think that the goal, it's changing on economic patterns of Syria. It's for changing patterns of economic in Syria and mobilizing even more of the hand of the regime family and its supporters. The regime, with the support of Iran and Russia, is creating a demographic shifts in population swaps in Damascus and in Homs, where these cities have been historically a center of middle class, and the government had to negotiate with them and their support. The regime now is bringing more loyalists and people that they support him to the city to weaken the traditional power of these cities and the middle class. And these middle class, I mean, I also need to, I mean, I don't mean that these middle class, they oppose to the regime, but they have supported the regime because sometimes they have their own reasons or their benefits. I will stop here because my colleague will continue. Thank you.
Thank you.
I tend to have a loud voice, so I think I'll hurt you if I use a microphone.
You need it for the recording.
It's for the recording. Sorry. Right. Thank you for hosting such an important topic at a time where the military dynamics in Syria are calming down, and therefore such issues are becoming more and more important to address. Now, I'll be talking about housing, land and property within the context of forced displacement and within the context of these quote-unquote deals that happened. I worked for the Office of the Higher Commissioner as a consultant, interviewing hundreds of people that either negotiated these deals themselves, members of armed factions, and civilians who've been displaced. And I want to share with you some of the issues that were raised. I guess the first point to kind of focus on, or which I think is important, is this game of semantics that Amr was talking about. The same physical act is a group of people moving from one place to the other. You could call it evacuation and look like a hero, or it could be forced displacement and you're a criminal. The mere fact that the parties to the conflict, particularly the regime, is playing with this semantics game shows that this game is important. If they did not care, and I'll give you a few examples of how they cared, then perhaps we should be having another panel talking about something different. But the mere fact that this game is going on shows the importance of the issues. So we've got these reconciliation deals, peace agreements, evacuation, population transfer, forced displacement, all names of a very similar thing. And so what I will do is address each of the housing, land and property issues, situations before the wars, and then during the conflict and besiegement, and then what happened afterwards. Now, I sneakily looked into Emma's notes while she was writing them about the situation before the war, so I will not cover that and let her go into enough details. But what we must understand is that the situation before the conflict in terms of housing, land and property was not great. We did not have that strong legal infrastructure that guaranteed rights. A lot of informal settlements, difficult ways to prove ownership, and that in a conflict setting becomes far more difficult. Now again, forced displacement and these deals occurred mainly by the government. At some point it was 15 to 2, 15 areas that were displaced compared to 2 areas in Idlib that were displaced by the opposition. And the reason I'm focusing on government-held areas is, first of all, as a matter of prioritizing who unfortunately in Syria we're in a situation where we have to focus on someone, not to say that they're the only perpetrators, but they're also the state, and the state has more responsibility. And the issue of reconstruction, which you'll hear about also, is happening at the behest of the government. And so I think that's what, and they're also the military coming out, they're the ones succeeding in the military campaign. And I guess that warrants a bit of a focus here. When the armed conflict started, and we must remember that the armed conflict did not start in 2011, it started around 2012. What you have in that period is often neglected, but also helps to set the context. When the conflict started, you had numerous international humanitarian law breaches, starvation, Amr touched upon some of them, destruction of objects that are indispensable for civilian lives. And I'm happy that Marco touched upon the cases from the International Tribunal for Former Yugoslavia, because it said you don't have to actually tell people to go, you just have to make it impossible for them to stay through your coercion and physical acts. And there are numerous UN reports that you could look into that. There's an Amnesty report called Surrender or Die. And that in itself is a problem, because it highlights the issue that population transfer wasn't just happening for combatants, but in the eyes of the regime, anyone who had the political opposition was classified as someone who is worthy of transferring them, because civilians are not supposed to be able to surrender. They are not combatants in the first place. And I think that mix, because transfer of combatants is legal. There's nothing in the definition that Marco gave. It was clearly focused on civilians. And so it's important to distinguish between those who were transferred and the demographic engineering resulting from those who opposed politically and those who picked up arms, at least for legal purposes. And so due to all these breaches, what we had is either the opposition or the regime saying, okay, let's talk. Let us find a way out. And there were many terms on these deals. I will not go over them all. But it had a clause, whoever wants to stay can stay, whoever wants to leave can leave. And again, we're grateful that the court of former Yugoslavia said that they must have a genuine choice. It's not a matter of you giving them the choice. The choice is supposed to be genuine. And I'll leave you to imagine whether that choice was genuine at the time in the circumstances that myself and Amr tried to explain. And so what I'm trying to highlight is that when we're looking at demographic engineering or forced displacement or laws, in this situation of Syria in the conflict, we must always look at context. We cannot look at one issue without or discarding the others. We cannot look at reconciliation deals without seeing what led to them or what happened after them. And so most people who politically oppose the regime or picked up arms left. Some people did stay, and they went through a process which usually ends up within 6 months with them joining, having to join, being forcibly conscripted into the Syrian army. Now, my understanding is forced conscription is the form of labor, forced labor, that is legal in a sense. A lot of governments still have it. Debatable, but there is still less of an uproar. But at least in the UK refugee law and immigration law, when you can actually base your asylum application on the fact that you could be conscripted into an army that is committing war crimes. And again, I urge you all to look at what the Syrian army has committed. So once these people leave after the conflict, we get issues like property law number 10, law number 10 of 2018, a law passed by the government that says within 30 days, which links again to the strict time frame that Marco was talking about, to register your property or you lose it. It caused a big political uproar. Numerous human rights organizations started writing about it. A lot of European governments, perhaps for right or wrong reasons, people needed the refugees to return. So if you're taking their properties away, how can we send them back? So we've somehow united the right and the left wing together to kind of go against the law number 10. Recently, though, in a meeting that Jan Egeland, one of the humanitarian advisors to the UN Special Envoy that is soon, he's leaving us soon, said that Russians told him that the law number 10 is being withdrawn, and that caused a bit of a media attention. I'm not a Syrian lawyer, I specialize in the UK. But I spoke to my Syrian judges and my Syrian lawyers, and there's no such thing as withdrawing a law, at least not through a media statement that you make. It's far more complicated than that. But perhaps shows that that political pressure works one way or the other. And so, after people left, were faced with the issue of let us reconstruct Syria, which I understand is a topic of the second panel, so I will not be getting into that. But this raised a lot of questions of will reconstruction consolidate crimes like forced displacement and cause further issues of housing, land and land and property issues. Now, these are not my words, but the words of Bashar al-Assad himself about demographic engineering, saying that Syria now is more homogeneous. The people who are against us left. And then there was this concept of the beneficial Syria, Syria al-Mufida, and that was the areas that were under the regime control. So you do have these things that show you that there was an intention. Is it sectarian? I have mixed views about that. I think it's political, which doesn't make it better in any case. I mean, sometimes we know when things are sectarian, it causes an uproar. But in other cases, if it's political, then it's fine that people lose their homes. It isn't. So I'll get to my recommendations later, perhaps when we get towards the end of the panel. But it's important, if I can stress one point, is that everything in terms of demographic engineering and forced displacement, we need to look at the entire bigger picture. The laws in Syria look great, but we must ask, are they just on paper, or how do they actually reflect the reality on the ground? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Got 5 seconds left or something.
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much. Now I'll invite the other panelists, in case you want to add something to what has been said, you can do so, and then we'll start the discussion with the audience. Anybody?
Ask
Yeah.
a question rather than
Exactly.
pass judgment. Thanks both of you for the detailed presentations on what is a very important area. I think one of the points that came out, certainly in my mind, was that whilst we have seen this accelerated more recently, these are problems that go back a very long way. And as I think Ibrahim has said, peeking over to his neighbour's notes is something that Emma's going to be dealing with. So I don't want to raise it now, but certainly from my side, one of the difficulties in dealing with something like this is because it does go back so far. And obviously, I had some involvement along with Rodri on similar situation in Bosnia and how the property implementation laws was actually used as a tool for ethnic cleansing. And of course, Bosnia has also been raised, and so the Dayton Peace Accords has been raised in the context of Syria as well, almost carving the country up like a cheese board, which I think is very worrying. I think for us that have been involved in Bosnia, I don't think Bosnia can be used in any context as a particular success. Obviously it stopped the conflict, but looking at the country now, there are still very serious political tensions. And one of the points that I wanted to make was that certainly in Bosnia, what you would see is people returning to their pre-war properties, but then selling their properties to return to a part of Bosnia where they felt more protected in their own ethnic groups. And I think that is obviously a very serious risk for Syria as well. So I'm not making any recommendation or really have any idea on how it can be solved, but I think this really does highlight some of the challenges that are going to be faced.
I also feel like I'm better placed to maybe ask a question than to make a determination at this point of any kind. And I wonder, from your perspective, what the position of the government of Syria, the regime, is going into or continuing with a process of sort of various negotiation tracks that are meant to lead to some sort of a resolution of the conflict. Is it the case, do you feel, that the highest goal of the regime would be to maintain the sort of picture on the ground as it is? Are there areas where return would be allowed or perhaps even welcome? Are there any incentives anywhere in Syria to sort of allow return and allow the types of property concessions that it would take for return to be potentially sustainable? I mean, I hate to sort of boil it down to a question as facile as, is this the central aim of the government, or is it a negotiating chip? But to some extent, that's the question.
Do you want to add something, or do we just...
I can pick up on the point in myself.
Okay. Okay, well, maybe you've noted the question. Maybe if there's questions from the audience, we'll take them now, and then they will be answered afterwards. Any takers? Otherwise, you can start answering, and then maybe some volunteers will come up. Ah, okay. Yes, please. So there's two.
Yes, I think there are 2 points I think that probably need to be mentioned. I'm Abdullah Sayed, a Syrian lawyer. The first question is really legal, which is I'm wondering that there is somewhat something missing in the analysis of Professor Marco Sassoli and in this concept of democratic engineering, which is presenting the situation as though sort of a biopolitical normal process of a government, whilst it is more really a crime that is probably a crime against humanity, forcible displacement of population, which obviously raises issues of accountability. This is my first point. So the idea is, why is it that we are now engaging into such a new concept whilst we have the tools and the prism through which we could look at what is happening in Syria, there is an intention and a policy, and that is all clear, and it needs just to be proven before a court. The second thing is more factual, which is I just don't want to leave the discussion without saying that when one talks about return, it does seem to me that there is in many, many areas a physical impossibility of return. Every city or a town where a demonstration existed, the entire population, the entire city is in fact obliterated. What you see now in many places around Damascus, but also in other places in Syria, is towns that are completely, or to a complete extent, extinguished. I mean, there are just stones and rubbles, but that's all. So these are my 2 points.
Maybe the last one over there, and then we'll start responding to this one first.
Thank you. My name's Andrew Songa, and I just had a brief question to Amir and Ibrahim, just from the perspective of civil society. Have there been any initiatives within civil society to do documentation with a view of profiling displaced persons, just to kind of understand what the profiling looks like in terms of documenting displaced persons, and maybe if it has moved to a stage of trying to gauge their perceptions on what durable solutions would work for them, whether it's return, integration, or resettlement?
I'll start then. Sure. Right, so I'll address a few of the points mentioned. Yes, I agree, Toby. It may be a possibility that people would go and that theoretically people could go back and sell and come back. But then, as you rightly mentioned, there is both a physical impossibility in this situation and a security impossibility. I mean, the law number 10, for example, allows you to get one of your relatives to go and ask about you. Friends of mine who have their fathers disappeared, arrested by security forces, would not dare to go ask where their father is, let alone go and ask where the property is, because they'll take you with them. So there's a lot of contextual issues that we need to be aware of when addressing this issue. What the regime wants out of it, difficult to guess. I mean, the statements made by the head of state shows that they want control, they want political control. And the fact that it's the Russians that said that law number 10 is withdrawn, and the fact that Russia said the regime agrees to our deal in Sochi, shows that the regime doesn't have much to say in the first place. It's all a proxy war in that sense. So what do the proxies want? I spent 7 years trying to figure out that answer, but I don't think that the regime in itself is in high bargaining power. We can see that over Iran, for example, now of it leaving or not leaving. So it's not very clear on that front. I fully agree on the point of physical impossibility. In terms of documentation, a lot of civil society organizations are working on this. Maybe Amar can talk a little bit about what his previous organization did. Trying to kind of figure out who left where and where their properties were. But again, there is an issue. So for example, I mean, this is a sad example, but one organization had this idea of trying to register your property through technology, through putting pins. They no longer recognize the place. You know, it's destroyed. Like a guy went back to Deir ez-Zor and said, I don't know where my house is. It's gone. So we're dealing with that sort of situation because of all the breaches that happened. So it is a challenge. We are trying our best. In terms of what people want, I think each case is individual. Some people want to stay outside, some people want to go back, some people want to live in a different area. We cannot draw a blanket statement. What the Russians and the regime are doing, and also some movements within Europe, is trying to say all refugees must return. We need to start reconstruction, and I think we need to be careful, being a bit more nuanced when dealing with each case on its own, because as Marco has said, it's individual voluntary return. No one can decide on each other's behalf.
I just want to add to Rodri's comment on what the regime want. Actually, there was an incident last week where there, I guess, a family that returned from Idlib to Damascus, and they were all arrested. So I don't think they are negotiating in a way. And for Andrew, yes, as Ibrahim mentioned, I personally worked in a pilot project on documenting forced displacement. There are few organizations are working on that. It's not a trend because mainly was the human rights violation what was taking all the attention. Recently, now people started to document HLP issues. I can tell you from the findings from of the pilots we did like a year ago. Mainly people wanted to return, but also depends on what we did was internal displacement. So we didn't go to refugees. The ones were IDPs. All of them they wanted to go back to their communities.
Big possessive with the mic.
Okay, so we're going to move to the second part of the discussion, of the presentation, and then you'll have other opportunities to ask questions and comment later on. So during this first part, we've seen that there are many elements that seem to indicate an intention of authorities to go for demographic engineering, to have actions that result in demographic engineering. And housing, land and property can be one of the tools, or has been one of the tools used by the regime to do that. The Law 10 has been mentioned, and I think in the second part of the discussions we'll hear more examples of how demolitions, for example, post-war reconstruction, urban renewal projects can also be aspects that can consolidate the displacement that has already taken place. And so it's probably a call for those who want to engage into reconstruction to be very careful and exercise due diligence if they want to avoid creating harm. So I'll give the floor first to Emma Beals, please. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to try and give you about a 20-minute speech in 7 minutes, so strap in. So it's important to understand that Syria historically had several problems with the HLP picture which lead us to where we are today. So there was a range of zoning and ownership structures and titles, including sort of where land is zoned, and that also there was a lack of sort of formal property records for individuals in terms of being able to prove that they owned a particular property. In the pre-war period, there was a large amount of population movement from rural areas through to the urban areas, and most of that population movement was consolidated in what we call informal housing areas. And so by the start of the war, 35 to 50% of the urban population was living in what is known as informal housing. It's a particular type of zoning. And those areas are now at risk of displacement, and they're very political, and we'll get to that a little bit later. There's a whole range of pre-war housing and development policies that build on top of each other, hundreds and hundreds of laws. There was corruption and patronage systems in effect in terms of giving people social housing. There was areas zoned for developments where people were annoyed that their house was going to be taken. All of these things were building up in the pre-war period, and they helped to become one of the drivers of the conflict. So HLP rights, because it was a cross-cutting issue. So it sort of joins up with things like socioeconomic issues, the security state, and all of these other things that helped to build into a conflict driver. And that's why when we get to these maps, you see a large correlation between sort of informal housing areas and areas of opposition support during the conflict. Huge amount of HLP legislation during the war, so more than 45 laws impacting HLP have been passed during the war alone, and those built on top of other laws that were passed before the war. So the most famous one is Law 10. Al-Watan were reporting today actually that there's only a minor amendment being made to Law 10. It's going to be passed as it is, so maybe rather than asking how much power Damascus has, we should be asking how much power Russia has. There's also a whole suite of other laws. So for example, counter-terrorism laws, it was reported that 40,000 properties were expropriated in 2017 alone under counter-terrorism laws. So people that supported the opposition or were displaced. You have Law 3, which is the rubble law that was passed earlier this year that can be used to expropriate or demolish damaged properties. There's Law 15, which is another law that is being used in Aleppo neighborhoods at the moment to expropriate properties. So these are kind of all layer on top of each other. We then have Law 10, which is kind of a consolidation of these various laws and expands the powers within the laws that already exist. But the important thing to remember is that even if you change a line of Law 10, even if you throw Law 10 out, it's actually going to have no impact on the fact that properties are being expropriated today, and that the whole sort of suite of laws work together to ensure that the government can kind of zone at will and take properties under all sorts of different legal frameworks. There is a lack of records. People, when they fled their properties, didn't necessarily take their housing documentation with them because, you know, why would you? Or they were destroyed, they got wet, they were in a tent, it rained, all sorts of reasons why people don't have those documentation. There's also irregular documentation. The government made it illegal in 2016 for any kind of property transfers outside of the government control. So huge parts of the country were outside of the government control for much of the war, and any kind of rental or sale that went on in those areas was illegal. Or maybe you got a document from a local council run by the opposition. If you take it back into government-held Syria and rock up to the civil documentation office, they might put you in the jail. So there's all these kind of issues that are going on. It's also not just HLP. So being able to access your HLP rights or assert them, even to rent a property to somebody else, this is what that looks like. We're going to run through it very quickly. I'm an individual, I want to go back to Syria, or I want to rent or sell my property, or get restitutions for it in some sort of magical example in the future. First of all, I need a security permission. The first thing I have to do is to engage with the security state. So that could involve outstanding arrest warrants. Jamil Hassan had said that there are 3 million people with arrest warrants now, which is 12.5% of the pre-war population. Military service, that's mandatory. Lots of people who left didn't want to do military service, so you risk being dragged into that simply to sell your house. There's even sort of seemingly benign laws like the fact it's illegal to leave without an exit stamp, which isn't very often utilized, but could be at any time. So there's all these kind of bear traps. And circumnavigating it is very difficult because it's very opaque. There isn't sort of a simple process for redress if you fall foul of that. Okay, so if you get through all of that, you've got the permission from the security services, you then need your documentation. 75% of refugees are missing at least one critical identifying piece of documentation. Whether it's your identifying information, your husband's or father's, you inherited the property, your children, your wife, whatever it is, that's a huge issue. Even if you do have your documentation, if you want to sell your property or to repair your property, you may need to pay back taxes. So you need to go through sort of water or electricity bills. Sometimes for the period that you were not living in the property, someone else might have been living in the property. And you have to pay all of those before you can then engage in various activities you might want to do with your property. Even if you have the security state's permission to return, you get back to your part of the country, there might be a militia that says you cannot go there. They're standing at the end of the street, you can't go there. Even if you do get back there, even to engage through some of the humanitarian channels to get a repair kit for your property, you have to have navigated all of that and proved ownership of the property. So it's a massive labyrinth. It's a huge amount of bureaucracy and risk involved for an individual to prove that this is their property in order to be able to live in it, sell it, do whatever. And that's if the property is still standing. There's a huge amount of damage as well. So here's a map where I've overlaid the informal housing as zoned in 2008 by the government with the opposition areas. And the purple is damage, but this isn't an exhaustive, the damage isn't exhaustive. But what we're going to do is look in detail at a specific area. of the suburbs of Damascus, which is sort of Bazay and Kabul. So these areas saw protests turn lethal very early in the conflict. And some of the dissatisfaction with the government that sort of arose in this area dates back to the 1970s, when there were land expropriations that took place. And that led to some civil unrest in the 1970s and 80s. And then that sort of bubbled up again at the beginning of the uprising. So then in 2012 and 13, we have the Commission of Inquiry and HRW both documented razing of properties. So opposition that were pushed out of that area very early in the conflict then had those properties razed, and that was deemed by these rights organisations to be unlawful. In 2012, the governor of rural Damascus said that those demolitions were required to drive out the opposition, so it was political in intent. Then for several years there was kind of a local truce, and what that involves is not really a truce as we might know it. It was access restrictions, and life was pretty difficult. And then the area went through what we heard about earlier, which is the so-called Reconciliation, and there was forced displacement after a heavy military campaign in these areas. So in Bazay, the Reconciliation deal involved 10,480 people who were displaced on those green buses, which is 20% of the area's pre-war population were forcibly displaced. And the chance of those people being allowed to go home are very small. Kabul also saw people living on those buses as well. And the map in the bottom corner is a very recent Human Rights Watch report where they have used satellite imagery to document the demolition of properties in Kabul, which is part of this process as well. So those houses are now gone. So those people are going to have an even harder time to exert any sort of HLP rights. These areas have also been nominated as early Law 10 development areas. So what you're going to see is the intent of the government to try and encourage and foster reconstruction in these areas off the back of that whole series of activities that have gone on to displace people so that they may not be able to return, and also to destroy the properties or expropriate those properties. What does that mean for people outside of Syria? So for European governments, Western governments who are thinking about reconstruction, we have a similar situation in eastern Aleppo. So you can see the hatching under the green, which is the informal housing in eastern Aleppo. The green is opposition control for most of the war. The purple is damage. What we've seen with refugee intention surveying is that the ability to return to place of origin is really important for people's push-pull factors. Folks, like all of us, we don't just want to go back to the country and end up sort of somewhere that we've never lived before. You want to go back to your city or the part of the city you used to live in. So 1.5 million registered refugees list Aleppo as the area of origin, and then we break down how many of those live in other places. So those are the kind of numbers from one part of one city that will be affected by the fact that this whole suite of activities are taking place to ensure that that displacement is permanent and their HLP rights are infringed upon. I'll get to the recommendations later when we're doing this extra bit of the panel, but just to say that the solutions to these, as my colleagues have said, is that this can't be fixed in a line-by-line sort of looking at different laws or project by project. This is sort of a high-level structural problem that needs to be dealt with at that very high level, the political level, redrafting the laws in sort of totality.
Many thanks. It's really fascinating to hear, all these things that are happening, and we can go back to it, I hope, later on. So now, Toby, if you can tell us your take on situations.
Thank you. I think I'll take the note from what other people have said and start with the recommendations, because nobody's had time to do their recommendations yet. And I think I spoke about this at Chatham House a while ago, and about Reconstruction in particular. And I made the point that I thought it was unrealistic to start thinking about things like Reconstruction. And I was told I was being naive because it's going to happen and it's happening. I still have some difficulty sort of accepting that. I think that the Reconstruction will happen. And you heard from the gentleman that whole neighbourhoods in Syria have been completely devastated, and so what are you actually returning to? We've also heard that people can't register properties because they don't know where their properties are. And of course, we also have to look at who's actually going to be carrying out the reconstruction. One of the statements from the Syrian government was that the contracts would be awarded to their friends, meaning Syria, Russia, Iran, and others that have supported them. So that in itself is deeply disturbing. And then one of the other comments that was made to me was that, well, I'd raised the question, how can you ensure that the reconstruction will be in accordance with what we accept as norms? How can we ensure that it will be properly monitored and will not be contributing to the commission of crime, whether it's war crimes, crimes against humanity, or whether it is further forced displacement. And I was told, well, we have the UN guiding principles for that. And I said, are you seriously expecting a government that doesn't respect any principle of international law, that has killed more than 500,000 people, to be bothered about the UN guiding principles? So it is difficult to understand to what extent this can be done, and this can be done properly. But we do have to recognise that it will be done. And I think the naivety that I expressed was that it will be done, and it is already starting, and so we have to ensure that it's done properly. One of the comments that was made with people returning is that there are 3 million arrest warrants for individuals, and as Ibrahim has said, people already who are returning are facing security situation in relation to them and their family members. I actually wonder whether Jamil Hussein, when he actually made the comment of 3 million, whether he included his own arrest warrant in that number as well, as he actually has 2 arrest warrants out for him now, thanks to France and Germany. Those matters aside, I think the 2 fundamental issues as far as reconstruction and return is concerned. First of all, it is far too early to even start thinking about return. But the two points that I focused on before, and I think they remain 2 very important considerations, is that accountability has to be at the core of any reconstruction efforts. You cannot have a return to normality, even if the conflict has ceased, in the absence of accountability. We've seen it in a number of states where you don't address the central issue of accountability, the circle of violence continues, and it will continue unless individuals are held accountable. The other point is that you have to think of reconstruction as more than just bricks and mortar. It's not building houses, it's not building schools, building hospitals. That is, of course, absolutely critical, but it's institutions. And this plays into the notion of accountability as well, in my view, is that you have to build up those institutions that have really never existed in many people's lives in Syria. And that is justice institutions, and institutions that they can have some sense will deliver justice. As was said at the beginning, I first became involved in looking at Syrian matters very early on in the revolution, in I believe it was the summer of 2011 when I first started, and it was in relation to a doctor who had returned to Syria. He was Syrian. He visited his brother in America and then returned to Syria to help people in Aleppo who were being targeted, not people on any particular side of the conflict, but he was a doctor, so he was returning. And as a result of the petition that he signed, helping casualties, he was executed, brutally, tortured and killed. And so that was sort of my first introduction into the Syrian conflict. And we've heard a lot about schools being targeted. We've heard a lot about hospitals. That is going to take a very long time to rebuild that. But it's not just, as I say, bricks and mortar. It's also having an institutional framework across the board. How are you going to implement a system of lustration, which is absolutely critical? Who are these individuals who are going to serve as judges? Who are going to serve as law enforcement? When you look at the recent attempts by the Assad regime to issue death certificates in respect of those that were killed at Sednaya, as a particular example, if you look at the documentation by Caesar, who had documented 11,000 deaths, these were all signed and stamped by judges. And how are you possibly going to have any kind of confidence in a system where these same judges will be sitting in judgment? And so it is a huge problem. Now, as far as the forced displacement, and I don't want to end being completely negative, although it is very, very depressing to work on Syria. I mean, I've worked on a number of different conflicts, and I think this is one of the most depressing conflicts that I've ever had to work on, because you don't see any end in sight, and you don't see any accountability. But on the forced displacement side, I think why it is of particular interest now is it does potentially show that there could be a way of addressing accountability. Many of you will be aware that recently the ICC issued a ruling as far as the Rohingya are concerned. And so, using Bangladesh jurisdiction, they have found a way to at least address one aspect of accountability. And so the same can be said for Syria. And this is something that we are working on. Our group has met with the Commission of Inquiry to look at the numbers of individuals and the time periods of where people have been forced out of the country into Jordan, because Jordan is a state party to the International Criminal Court. And in my view, it's going to be very, very difficult for the ICC to take a position as far as one case and a different position as far as Syria. It may well have been envisaged at the time that it was being dealt with, but at least that shows that there is the possibility to deal with accountability. And I don't think that we can realistically deal with any of these issues until we start looking at it. The final point that I wanted to make, as I am now out of time, is, and I'm sure we can deal with that in questions, is to what extent are companies going to be participating in the commission of war crimes? And we only have to look at the situation of Lafarge, a very large construction company in France that has been shown to have been involved with ISIS. We have a French bank that is going through a legal process now for contributing and financing the genocide in Rwanda. So there is a process where corporations can be held accountable and should be held accountable. But the biggest question, as I said from at the beginning, is how are we actually going to effectively monitor that? And I think that's going to be the very difficult task. Thank you.
So we've seen that a lot has been happening in Syria to make sure that return would be made as difficult as possible. We've heard about the security clearance, we've heard about the legislative dimension of it, the demolitions, and property dispossession. So legal redress in this context can do a lot, to facilitate either return or at least other solutions to displacement. And Rodri is going to tell us about that.
Barbara began with a question of what is possible in Syria, and I think I may be the least qualified person at this table to discuss that. And so I thought perhaps a better starting point for me would be to help us all identify the gap between what is possible in Syria and what is preferable in Syria, at least on the issue of restitution, by trying to set out some of the principles that an ideal restitution process would respect. This is based on a sort of distillation of international experience in a lot of other contexts, including Bosnia. And it's important to note that in none of those contexts, including Bosnia, were all of these principles respected in a perfect way. But nevertheless, I think it is possible to say that if you can sort of distill best practice down to a couple of PowerPoints, it would probably correspond to these. And I know that there are some things that I'm leaving out. Oops. Am I pressing the wrong button? I just got to... Just ask my kids, remote controls are not my strong point. I wanted to start by contrasting restitution from reconstruction. As Toby said, rightly, there are enormous rights and international law implications raised by reconstruction, but reconstruction is, as typically understood, a political effort to recreate the infrastructure and institutions of a state where they've been damaged or destroyed by conflict and disasters. Restitution brings us firmly back into the area of rights and international law. But it's also important to point out that restitution is an emerging area in international law. It has established itself quite firmly in many respects. It does get prominent mention and strong reinforcement, for instance, in the international humanitarian law, customary international law study. But it's also important to point out that the focus always begins with the way that rights are defined and protected at the national level, because there's no other sensible way to define a restitution program than by looking at the rights that have been violated and the rights that are asserted by victims. International law, in this sense, provides a really important backstop. Where there are ambiguities, where there are gaps, relevant international standards such as the Pinheiro Principles and practice can be used to provide guidance. But fundamentally, restitution is a form of reparations. There are other forms, such as compensation, guarantees of non-repetition, and so forth. But restitution is particularly well suited to property violations because it involves trying to restore the thing that was taken. In cases of forced disappearance and other human rights violations that we more typically think of, that's obviously an impossibility. But in the case of property, it can often be done. And in that context, it is possible to think about reparations is a misprint there in the final bullet point, to think about reconstruction as a kind of in-kind compensation where restitution isn't possible. So in other words, where in situations where entire neighborhoods have been destroyed, reconstructing them and giving the apartments back to the people who lost them can be a kind of reparations, a kind of compensation, even if it's not actual restitution. I did it again. What do I do? It's reassuring that it's not just me. Thanks.
Sorry, then use this.
Good. Okay, great. Two vital components of restitution that I want to cover as quickly as I can, and we can talk more about where they come from and what case studies we have later on. First, I want to talk about recognition. These are two things that would be very important for the Syrian government to do if there was going to be a meaningful restitution program. Recognition of property rights held by the victims and recognition that violations of those rights occurred, thereby raising the need for reparations in the form of restitution and compensation to be provided. A second vital component is the actual remedy that you provide. And there's an important procedural element to that as well as an important substantive element. Recognition of property rights. What are we talking about? In principle, the state should recognize the continuity of all de jure, legal property rights, as well as de facto rights to land and property that were necessary for the people that held them to be able to meet their own fundamental needs, housing and livelihood foremost. In international law, this follows a distinction between the right to property which is basically your right to title, even of properties that you don't use for your own personal needs, as well as the rights to housing and security of tenure, which involves rights to remain in properties that you use for your personal needs, even if you don't have title to them. They're two sides of the same coin, in essence. Claims in situations like Syria can rest on either basis, the right to property or the right to housing and security of tenure, but they're strongest, obviously, when they rest on both homes that you own. So moving on to the specific categories of property rights that can be recognized. Oh boy, there. Obviously, de jure property rights of ownership, legal title, are the strongest. Most straightforward. These are rights that are clearly defined and protected in national law in every country. There may still be obstacles to recognition of these rights in the context of a restitution program. In many cases, property documentation has been lost by owners, and/or property records have been destroyed or manipulated. And in these situations, even full title property rights can be hard to establish. There's also the possibility that property has been confiscated, been deemed abandoned for a long period of time. For instance, there may be rules that even if you own property, you can lose your rights to it if you don't pay property taxes regularly. There's also the possibility of expropriation for public purposes. For instance, in many cases, private property may be expropriated or confiscated and either temporarily or permanently reallocated to others. And of course, we've seen that in Syria. There's also the risk of exchanges and sales, where owners, very often under an atmosphere of coercion, as we've discussed, either sell or exchange their properties in order to be able to have some cash that will allow them to flee to safety. There's also the issue of de jure legal tenure rights. My time's already out. Wow. Plus 1 minute. Okay. In these cases, there is still a clear definition in national law, but it's less strongly protected. And it means that in many cases, you have all the sort of similar problems to formal property rights in terms of loss of documents and records, plus a much easier possibility that the property in effect could be expropriated or confiscated. Because very often, these sort of use rights or tenure rights are conditioned on ongoing use or occupation. And the types of laws that set out those requirements don't take into account the fact that people may be forced to flee in wartime. They're not written with wars in mind. And very often they can be abused to cancel the occupancy rights of people who have fled because of conflict. Finally, de facto rights, and this is the most difficult category because they're not defined or not sufficiently defined in national law, and they're certainly not protected. And this may, in fact, reflect discrimination against certain groups, marginalization of the poor, inequality that may themselves be a conflict factor in the country. There are core factors in favor of recognition, or arguments in favor of recognition, which I don't have time to go through now. The key thing is that it's also important for states to recognize the fact that violations have occurred, and it is actually quite important for them to make efforts to understand the nature and scope of the violations and their geographical and temporal parameters, because that can be very important to developing procedures for restitution that do not force the thousands of claimants to each bring all full evidentiary support for their claims, but rather to create a programmatic system of reparations where you can make a determination at the outset that large-scale property violations happened at these times in these places, and that victims who can show that they come from those places and lost their property in those times have a right to a presumption that they were victims of those displacement patterns, which allows an administrative, simplified process where alternative forms of evidence can be accepted. last point, and this is maybe the most difficult, substantive aspects of the remedy. Restitution and compensation, and the decision about in what cases do you allow full restitution, in what cases do you try to promote compensation, are incredibly, incredibly difficult and politicized. But I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
How much margin do we have? Because it's, I think, 15 minutes and then... okay, good. So maybe now if each of you can make a recommendation, because I'm not sure it came out so clearly what recommendation we would give to either Syrian authorities or donors or people who want to be involved in reconstruction. So maybe we can go around the table, and that will be also an opportunity for you to add to the discussion. Thank you. I'll start with that.
I don't have a recommendation for now, but I just wanted to add to what Rodri said on manipulation of documents, that the Syrian government issued a law in last year on reconstructing property deeds of 35,000 documents that were in Aleppo, and they said that these documents were destroyed somehow, and now they are reconstructing these documents with a methodology that, they created.
So we're lucky. I don't know if lucky is the right word, but there are like case studies, precedents in international law where companies have been held accountable, even where they purchased things where they thought or knew that it was legal, or they had the legal deed for it, but they should have had reasonable belief to know that this was stolen in the first place. So we do have a lot of case studies coming out from Nuremberg and all these trials that would help us set precedent to scare away the bad companies, but not scare away all companies, because reconstruction is a sensitive topic to deal with. But to build up on what Toby was saying, I fear really that moving from a conflict situation to reconstruction without addressing accountability really fits into the ISIS recruitment narrative. All what they've been saying is, join us because the West is actually with the Assad regime. And so with reconstruction contracts, instead of just being neutral, we're actually awarding perpetrators and war criminals with fluid contracts and money. How do you think that would make someone who lost their house, lost their family members feel? So we need to be careful, because there's a bit of a counter-extremism narrative in this if we engage too quickly and not properly in reconstruction. In terms of the recommendation, I know this may sound simple, but and may not apply to you because you're here tonight. Just be wary of disinformation campaigns. I'm not going to use the word that Trump uses, but there's a lot of beep news out there, and it's mainly driven by the Russian propaganda, and they're not providing an alternative. They just make you doubt, right? So I'm glad that most of you, you chose on this evening to come and listen to us and inquire more. But I hope none of you end up in a situation where you say, I don't know what's happening in Syria, and just leave it at that. Because that's exactly what the perpetrators are trying to do in order to confiscate people's rights to properties. Speak to Syrians. They're around. You have 1 million of them in Europe. So I would want to hand you my notebook in compensation for taking your notes.
I guess my overarching recommendation would be that this requires political will, and it requires political will now. There are so many reports about these issues where there's sort of 50 recommendations, all of which are very legal and technical, and there's a utility for those activities, but they're not the solution to these problems. The solution to these problems is renewed political will from various countries who have some sway in this situation to try and push these issues into the forefront of the peace process, such that it is at this point. But again, it needs political will to kind of push it forward and actually get that off life support in some way. And that it's only at that level that there'll be an actual solution, something that isn't just sort of sticking plasters over these issues. And the problem is, if that doesn't happen now, and it doesn't happen soon, and it doesn't happen at a high enough level with enough pressure behind it, we are talking about more than half of the population of a country displaced, unable to return home, multi-generational kind of entrenched displacement and destabilizing forces. And it's very important to sort of realize that this isn't a situation where we can say, well, there's fewer bombs and it's a bit stable and a couple of people went back and didn't end up in prison, so it's all fine, isn't it? That's not the right approach, and that looking at even looking at, you know, programmatic solutions to this should be looking at them in a perspective, from the perspective of a holistic approach. How can we sort of be looking at what some kind of adjudication system or being able checks and balances that we're able to do, rather than sort of instantly drifting toward a Damascus-led solution to some of these issues, because they are the reason for these issues, so they're not going to be the solution. They're not going to be the ones offering those solutions. They need to come from outside, and they need that well, and we should get organised.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, obviously, ideally, the solution is to respect the law as I presented it. This will not work immediately. But it is possible. It doesn't solve the problems of the people affected. It is nevertheless possible to keep some principles. My preferred example is the Baltic states. To say, okay, perhaps once the political situation will change and we don't recognize the present political situation and we don't contribute to the consolidation of the present situation. And then the question is with what means? And ideally the means should be, but there my humanitarian heart is speaking more than my legal international law heart, targeted on some responsible people, and not generally to say simply, we don't contribute to reconstruction in Syria because it can take a lot of time until the political situation changes. One perhaps exotic idea, and which is not very new because we have it in the criminal law part, many of you will have heard about the triple IM. One could imagine something similar where people can register their property rights, and then this can put pressure on those who would like to make business with the property, because somewhere there would be a register in Geneva, Vienna, or wherever where there is still a claim there, which would then also avoid this effect of taking those who are in Syria somehow as hostages in the fight against the government which does not comply with the rules.
I'll support the last recommendation you made as a very sensible recommendation, and not one that I've heard made before. I think having an international body to deal with the property rights, I think, is a very sensible recommendation to make. I would just make two comments, and at the risk of repeating myself, just to say that justice has to be at the core of any discussions. And the second point is recognise that this is not going to be fixed in the short term. Recognise that the greatest burden of all of this, whether we're talking about property rights, justice, reconstruction, is going to fall on Syrians and Syrian institutions, and they need to be supported in the long term. And this is not a 4 or 5 year plan. This is a 20, 30, 40-year plan, because I think what we've seen from a number of situations around the world is a quick fix approach, which just does not work. I've mentioned Bosnia, and I'll repeat. Bosnia is a perfect example of that, is withdrawing international support far too early. And I think that certainly the amount of cases of just war crimes that the Syrian authorities are going to have to deal with one day is going to take years, if not decades. So the international community needs to recognize that it's long-term support which is needed.
I think I want to start by acknowledging that the case of Bosnia is often referred to in relation to Syria, and there are a lot of striking resemblances. But the one difference, which is absolutely fundamental, is that the preconditions at the end of the war in Bosnia were entirely different from the preconditions now in the closing phases of the war in Syria. And we will not see a repeat of Annex 7 or anything close to it. We will not see a repeat of the West having the type of influence and power in Syria that, and ability to decide things that it had in Bosnia for good and ill. And there's nevertheless one thing that I think is really central from Bosnia to take away with regard to Syria, and that is the fact that the international community in Bosnia spent a bit too much time thinking itself about what would make people sustainably return, and took too long to figure out ways to allow Bosnians to answer that question. And of course, security has been absolutely crucial where return has happened in Bosnia. Accountability has been absolutely crucial. There is no return until the first arrests of war crime suspects. But at the same time, the international community spent a lot of time reconstructing things that no one was going to move back to, constructing things that just got sold in corrupt transactions, and making all kinds of other messes in an expensive way. There will be factors in Syria that we need to understand that will affect how people will return, where they will return, how return can be sustainable. And the only way we will find those out is by engaging with Syrians and making sure that there is a reasonable dialogue early on between the people who may be in a position, hopefully in the future, to engage in responsible reconstruction efforts, and the Syrians who must benefit from those efforts. I'll leave it at that. Going over the time limit again.
You know. Okay, so maybe if we can extend by 5 more minutes. I mean, those who want to leave can leave, but yeah, if you have questions, we can take a few.
We've solved the house banana problem.
Yeah, well done. That was a useful panel. Okay, well then maybe. Okay, just to conclude, and then you want to final words. I think the panelists showed that we have a lot of information documenting demographic engineering in Syria, forced displacement, obviously, and also a sophisticated use of housing, land, and property in order to dispossess and displace people and to prevent their return. So the issue is, how can this information be used to influence the content of peace negotiations, ensure that housing, land, and property issues are discussed and appear in there, and how can this information inform reconstruction? I would say that maybe the hope that there is the fact that the needs in terms of reconstruction are so high that they go much beyond what Iran and Russia can provide. So maybe that's where there's a bit of bargaining power from other states who would like to be involved in reconstruction, if they want to, if they have the political will, to make sure that their involvement in reconstruction doesn't create new harms, doesn't consolidate displacement. So I think we probably need more events than this one to to get there. But really the call for me would be for reconstruction actors to make sure they ask the right persons. Anywhere, any city they want to get involved, do a profile of the city. Look neighborhood by neighborhood. What are the social economic dynamics? That's how you will better understand. Look at the satellite images. What was destroyed during the conflict and after the conflict? Why is that? Why are certain areas closed for return and not closed for return? That will tell you something about the dynamics and the potential attempt of demographic engineering. So, with this word, I'll give the final word to Natasha. Thank you, everybody, for coming and attending. Here's to you.
Thank you. Just 30 seconds. Just to first thank you all for your time and your attendance, and for the panelists for this wonderful discussion. I wanted just to inform you that the event was video recorded, and you will be able to find the video on the IBAHRI website and potentially the Geneva Academy. I'm not sure. And we will also produce a conference report that will also be available on our report and will be sent to all the participants. So you can also have a written summary of what has been discussed. And if you want to discuss further the topic, we can move now to a drink reception. There is food and some alcohol and drinks. So I hope we can continue the discussion, and maybe here or at another time in Geneva. Thank you very much.